Welcome back to the Fourth Wall Podcast. I'm Zach, and with me is Cody. Cody, right now I'm Googling best directors of all time. I'm seeing names like Alfred Hitchcock, Stanley Kubrick, Orson Welles, and also on there is Quentin Tarantino.
That's our boy.
That's our boy. And he has a new movie out, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Just came out, and it takes place at the end of the 60s, in Hollywood, LA. Tarantino is working with maybe his best cast. There's Leonardo DiCaprio as Rick Dalton, who's kind of like a fading star in Hollywood. And then there's Brad Pitt, who's Leo's best friend, and also his stunt double, Cliff Booth.
All right, what's the matter, partner? It's official, old buddy. Well, it has been.
And it takes place during the time of the Manson murders, and Margot Robbie is in it from I, Tonya and The Wolf of Wall Street, and she plays Sharon Tate, one of their victims. And just a little spoiler warning, we're not going to give away any of the secrets of the movie, so we won't totally spoil it for you, but we are going to be talking about some scenes in the movie, so if you want to go into the movie completely fresh, I would suggest seeing that first and then coming to listen to this podcast. But Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Cody, what did you think of it?
Well, this was basically a movie tailor-made for me. It has a lot of some of my favorite elements in it. Of course, it's a Quentin Tarantino movie. It takes place in Hollywood. It's about cults. Just the list keeps going on and on. But like you said, I mean, this is his best cast for sure. Mm-hmm. Brad Pitt and Leo are awesome in pretty much every single scene. A lot of the scenes are just them kind of hanging out with Tarantino's trademark dialogue. And it was just very, very well done. Their performances were awesome. Zach, you had mentioned in a previous podcast when we were talking about a movie called Booksmart, how every one of these buddy movies has a scene where the two best friends, they'll have a fight, mm-hmm. and then the third act is them coming together, reconciling, and realizing that they were really best friends all along.
Yeah, Quentin Tarantino doesn't have time for little plot devices like that.
It's not that movie. They're best friends from the beginning, and from the first time we see them on screen until the last time we see them. And they're never not best friends. It was really cool. It was a different take on that kind of story. On the acting, though, Leo was absolutely phenomenal. Yeah. For me, the best scene was when Rick Dalton, the guy who you described, kind of a fading actor, flubs his lines on set. And he's like an alcoholic. And because his career is slowing, he really wants to make sure he doesn't blow this opportunity to shoot a pilot. And Tarantino has written an amazing trio of scenes for Leo to just completely hit it out of the park. So the first one, we see him blow it. He forgets his lines.
Line?
And then that turns it, once he gets his lines, it's just poor acting. In the scene, he's playing an actor who's acting poorly, which is difficult on its own, like playing a bad actor. And then toss in the fact that his character is slightly drunk, which is also difficult to play. And he just pulls that first scene off beautifully, right? Mm-hmm. And then we get a scene where he's throwing a fit in his trailer. He's angry with himself. He's throwing stuff all over.
Embarrass yourself like that in front of all those people.
But he manages to do it in a way where it's sad and angry at the same time. So that's phenomenal acting. And then to finish it out, to finish the arc, an absolutely incredible scene where he just nails the performance. So he starts off bad, gets angry with himself, and then comes in and kills it. I don't want to spoil that third scene for you, but really it's something you have to see to even know what we're talking about. Those scenes tell us so much about this character, Rick Dalton, that he's actually an amazing actor. He can be an amazing actor when he wants to be and when he pushes through his addiction issues. I would say maybe even a better actor than Leonardo DiCaprio himself. There were plenty of good performances this year, but I would totally support giving Leo another statue. Zach, what did you think of those scenes and just Leo's performance in general?
Yeah, I really like those Leo scenes. I feel like if you're listening to this and you haven't seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it probably sounds super indulgent. You have Leonardo DiCaprio, one of the biggest names in Hollywood, acting as an actor. and it is indulgent, but it's also really entertaining. And I think it's a solid movie from Quentin Tarantino. Like all Quentin Tarantino movies, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it totally rebels against the traditional plot structure feel. Reminded me a lot of Pulp Fiction in that way, where kind of events were just happening and you were witnessing them rather than like a super tight linear plot. One of the big complaints I'm hearing about this movie was Margot Robbie's character. She plays, Sharon Tate, and a lot of the movie is watching her just do random stuff like going to the movies by herself, trying to get into the movies for free. Her scenes aren't a crucial puzzle piece in the plot, but there's a lot of that in this movie, and somehow it's all entertaining.
I haven't seen another movie that has a scene where an actor goes to a theater and like watches their own performance. Sharon Tate's career was kind of ramping up at the time that this movie takes place.
I'm Sharon Tate. I'm in the movie.
You're in this?
That's me. I play Miss Carlson, the klutz.
Watching her face as she hears the audience laugh at her being funny and like applauding when she's kicking butt, like just being cool. That's the feeling that our main character, Rick Dalton, and even Cliff to some extent, Brad Pitt's character, are chasing for the rest of the movie. And it's an interesting contrast, those two characters.
All right, I got a question for you, Cody. You know how in the NBA, multiple superstars will all join the same team, and it'll take some games to figure out how they're all going to play together? A good example of this is in 2010 when LeBron James joined the two other superstars in Miami, Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh, and it took him about a quarter of the season to start clicking. Do you think that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood faced the same problem? You have Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, basically two LeBrons, and then also Margot Robbie, who's a big star, but at this point I would say she's maybe closer to a Paul George, and Quentin Tarantino couldn't figure out a way to get her into Leo's arc in a big way without slowing down the two LeBrons, Leonardo and Brad Pitt. So maybe that's why her plot felt so disconnected from Brad Pitt's and Leo's in the movie.
I can see how people would think that her arc is sort of tacked on, but I do think it's there for that contrast between Rick Dalton, who's towards the end of his career, and Sharon Tate, who's towards the beginning. And, it might not have been done perfectly. Maybe some folks think it's a red herring, and I actually would totally get that criticism.
Yeah, I can totally see how people think that her character is tacked on, and there's a lot of stuff in this movie that feels tacked on, and those complaints are valid, but it's still entertaining and good the whole time. Another criticism I'm hearing is Charles Manson's presence in the movie. I liked how Charles Manson wasn't a major character in this. In fact, we only see his face for one shot, and we see his followers too, and they mention Charlie a lot. It was similar to how in Ben-Hur, the 1959 movie, how that was set during the Roman Empire, and it had Jesus in one scene. It establishes their presence in the world and adds context to everything going on.
His presence sort of looms large over the film, even if he doesn't get a ton of screen time. It almost reminded me also of like Force Awakens, where the whole movie's about Luke, but you don't really see Luke until the very end kind of deal. I thought that was well done, and it took the focus off of the murderers and put the focus on the victim.
Perhaps another complaint is this is, the typical has-been story. Not only that, but a has-been actor story. So I was afraid that would just kind of get depressing, but even though we're watching Leo struggle, he kind of goes through adventures and interacts with people, and obviously he's got Brad Pitt, so it stays super fun and exciting the whole time. There were a lot of driving scenes in this movie, just a car weaving through the hills, or the camera will be it'll be in the back seat and you're just watching them drive. I honestly wouldn't mind if the whole movie was just that.
That was awesome. The production design, of course, deserves a shout out. I think that's where most of this $90 million budget went. You don't really see many period pieces set in the late 60s, early 70s. But the thing about this is it doesn't feel like a period piece. Like it felt like it was actually made in the late 60s, early 70s at times, especially the driving scenes, the highway scenes, things like that. I haven't seen the late 60s, early 70s done as well in anything else.
Yeah, the setting's really good. I'm going to contradict myself here in a minute, but I love the late 60s, early 70s vibe. You know, they had all the cars, the houses, and the buildings from that time period. There's hippies running around. There's one shot where it shows this really big, scary white building. Then when it pans up, you see the Fox logo at the top, and it all sort of indicates the power structures of that era with all the movie studios as powerful as they were. So yeah, we both obviously liked a lot of things about this movie, but let's get into what we did not like. I'll start us off, Cody. I am not a fan of Brad Pitt's silly humor. Overall, his character is really cool and really dynamic, but I just don't like it when Brad Pitt jokes are just him being aloof or silly. It reminded me a bit of his character in Burn After Reading, which was the gym trainer who was always like dancing and being silly. That character did not work for me at all.
We're hearing a lot of buzz about Brad Pitt in other podcasts and in the news and stuff, and he just seemed like his normal Brad Pitt performance.
Yeah, he stole the show.
I couldn't tell. So in the fight scene with Bruce Lee, like I couldn't tell if it was Cliff Booth's memory, or if it was just more him imagining himself beating up Bruce Lee. But so I guess some of that fantastical side of those scenes gets a little bit of a pass.
I think that scene was him just clearly thinking in his head, what would happen if I would have went with Leonardo to the movie studio that day. It was just him reasoning, just imagining. It was him just being like logical.
It was one of the few times in the movie where it didn't feel like reality. Tarantino's movies usually feel like a slightly tweaked version of real life.
Yeah.
With the exception of maybe some of the violence, which was kind of larger than life. But I feel like Tarantino earned those scenes with all of the character building and setup that he did in the first, large section of the movie.
Yeah, I would agree with it earning its moment of violence. You know, this movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it's not like Kill Bill, of course. It's not as bloody as that. But it did have its moments in this one. Violence is kind of a trademark of Quentin Tarantino. Another trademark of Quentin Tarantino is homages. He loves to sort of do a tribute to his favorite movies, and this movie kind of goes above and beyond in that area. He even takes the title, I would say even the title of his movie is an homage. You know, look at his previous film titles. They're all raw, gritty, and in your face. You know, Kill Bill, Hateful Eight, Django Unchained, Death Proof, Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction. But then you have this one, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It indicates less of a movie from the twisted mind of Quentin Tarantino and more of an homage to something bigger and almost kissing the ring of Hollywood in a way.
The title, of course, is referencing the two Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns, Once Upon a Time in the West, Once Upon a Time in America. And I just feel like the whole movie was a list of all the things that Tarantino loves. It just checks every single box, with maybe the exception of Eastern cinema, which, maybe it's because he did it to death in Kill Bill. But we got movies, Los Angeles, 70s television, 70s music, 70s radio, spaghetti westerns, crazy cartoonish violence. And as an homage to LA, if you're checking every single box, you need to throw some cults in there, which is, of course, the premise of the movie.
The premise was one thing that, although I said I did like it before, I'm just not a fan of Hollywood Golden Age periodical movies. I'm not into the history of Hollywood, but a lot of directors like Quentin Tarantino understandably are, so they got to make a movie about it. You have movies like La La Land, The Artist, Tropic Thunder, in a way. Sunset Boulevard, it's in the movie industry. The Coen brothers making Hail Caesar was another display of this, but where their filmography took a hit for it, this one manages to make a unique experience out of it.
And some of us literally can't get enough of that kind of stuff, so I loved it. Golden Age of Hollywood. from in the 50s and 40s and stuff, and then seeing the fallout in the 60s and early 70s. It was like kind of like the anti La La Land.
Yeah.
As fantastical as La La Land felt, that's how real, like a real world depiction of Hollywood that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood felt like. There's a lot more, of course, that we will leave as a surprise. This is a really dense movie, and there's plenty that we don't have time to cover. But Zach, if we just had to kind of sum it up in just one-liners to describe Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, how would you do that?
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is just all the ideas that Quentin Tarantino had that didn't fit into his first 8 movies.
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a movie full of sound and fury, signifying something.
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is if somebody with really bad ADD wrote a movie about Charles Manson.
Yes. And actually, I would say to close, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a well-executed mosaic of moments.
Once Upon a Time is Quentin Tarantino's biggest opening weekend with $40 million, which has got to be some kind of relief considering his last film, The Hateful Eight, made under $5 million opening weekend. But maybe a whiff of these box office numbers will motivate Quentin Tarantino to make a movie on a much bigger scale with mass appeal. He says he's going to make 10 movies, right? This was his 9th one. What do you think his last movie will be, Cody?
Well, the buzz out there says that he wants to make, believe it or not, a Star Trek movie, which of course is a major departure from his normal fare.
Yeah, Star Trek movie, well, for sure an R-rated one. I think we both agree that if Quentin Tarantino makes a Star Trek movie, it'll probably be the antithesis of a J.J. Abrams version. It's hard to imagine a Quentin Tarantino movie with spaceships shooting at aliens, but I can definitely see an entire Quentin Tarantino Star Trek movie taking place on the bridge of a ship with the captain and the crew running into a problem, and then there's 2 hours of dialogue figuring it out.
Yes, so much dialogue in space. I do think it would be interesting to see his take on the action blockbuster sci-fi movie. Like to get a glimpse of what his career would have been like had he gone the Christopher Nolan, Edgar Wright route of like making those big blockbuster movies. And just to prove that he can make his own spin on one of those types of movies.
He definitely could. What about a third Kill Bill? Complete the trilogy.
Please no. We've had enough. We've had 2 of them. They were good. Let's move on. But what do we actually want him to do? Zach, if you could have any Quentin Tarantino movie, the world is your oyster, what would it be?
I'd really like to see something in modern politics, maybe like a Cuban Missile Crisis movie. There was that movie 13 Days with Kevin Costner. I wasn't a big fan of that, but it would be a great way to have really good conversations between people with heavy Boston accents in the Kennedy administration, talking to Russians with deep Russian accents. I feel like that would be a good way to get a lot of dialogue out of Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be cool to see. He would maybe tweak the history a little bit, so where the Cuban Missile Crisis doesn't go exactly the way it went in real life.
Oh, totally. I also wouldn't mind another crime movie like Reservoir Dogs or Pulp Fiction. Quentin Tarantino's been jumping around genres for a while, but his best movies are his crime movies.
He's kind of done that, though, so I do wonder if he would end on that note. I think if he died today, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood would be a fitting send-off. It's a pretty good summary of, like, all movies ever made. But if I could see any movie from him, we've gotten Westerns, Eastern martial arts films, Los Angeles crime films. What I'd like to see is maybe another period piece, but set it, like, in the Victorian era. His take on like kings and queens, knights and castles, I think could be interesting. I don't think that our ideas will happen. I don't think he'll make a medieval film, or I don't think he'll make I don't know if he'll make a Cuban Missile Crisis film in particular. I think probably if he doesn't do a Star Trek film, he'll have some other odd genre to explore. He said that maybe if he does like a blockbuster movie, that's just a freebie. It doesn't count. It was more of like here, I told you I can do it. Now here's another one of my signature movies.
But the idea of doing 10 isn't to come up with a loophole. I actually think if I was going to do Star Trek, I should commit to it, all right? It's my last movie, all right? It's not there should be nothing left-handed about it.
Well, either way, I'll watch it.
All right, so those are our thoughts of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Let's move on to our recommendations. Zach, can you tell us a little bit about the recommendation segment on the podcast, and then also the movie that you recommended for me this episode?
Each episode, I'll recommend a movie for Cody to watch. He'll recommend a movie for me to watch, and then we'll talk about them during the following episode. So, last episode, I asked Cody to watch Paths of Glory. Paths of Glory is one of Stanley Kubrick's earliest films. Stanley Kubrick, he's the director of 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Shining, A Clockwork Orange. We probably mention him at least once an episode. In Paths of Glory, Kubrick gets into the bureaucracy of the French military front during World War I. And it's starring Kirk Douglas. And Cody, what did you think of Paths of Glory?
Paths of Glory was fantastic. And that's probably no surprise to you, Zach. And it's not just because of, it was made in the golden age of movies. That was cool. But it's because of its own merits as a movie. The film opens in World War I. And we get a little bit of background on the French military situation in 1916. A staff general, who's higher than a regular general, approaches one of our main characters, this fella named General Moreau, and he has a mission. He wants him to take a well-defended German position called the Anthill.
Paul, I have formal orders to take the anthill no later than the 10th, that's the day after tomorrow.
That comes pretty close to being ridiculous, don't you think?
And even the name of the location of the mission is interesting. When a real-life anthill is destroyed, pretty soon after, another one quickly forms. And you get the sense from the beginning of this movie that the mission is just doomed.
My division was cut to pieces. What's left of it is in no position to even hold the anthill, let alone take it.
Paul, if there's one man in this army who can do this for me, it's you.
So General Moreau then approaches our main character, Colonel Dax. And Dax is played by Kirk Douglas, who was a huge Hollywood star at the time. And he gives a pretty good performance. So Kirk Douglas doesn't want to take the anthill either because he knows it's a suicide mission. But unfortunately, it's an order, so he has to. And they set out to take the position. It's at this point that they are basically slaughtered in this epic battle. I'm not sure how they got all those extras for this no man's land sequence, but it was marvelous to behold. It kind of reminded me of the old epics from directors like D.W. Griffith and like Cecil B. DeMille. In the cinematography and direction of this film in general was outstanding. Like you see Kubrick's fingerprints all over it. The camera is moving around constantly like it's on a Steadicam, which, wouldn't be invented until later for The Shining, which was another Kubrick entry. This was groundbreaking for movies at the time. The camera movement, all that was really, it definitely gives the film like a modern feel. Some of the men survive this battle, and at this point the movie becomes like a legal drama kind of thing. It almost reminded me of A Few Good Men, and the audience is just like horrified with the way these men are being basically railroaded.
Perhaps it was an error of judgment on our part. On the other hand, if your men had been a little more daring, they might have taken it. Well, you see, Colonel, troops are like children. Just as a child wants his father to be firm, troops crave discipline.
I see.
And one way to maintain discipline is to shoot a man now and then.
The production design was excellent, from the battles, to the beautifully ornate French interiors, the conspicuous wealth and comfort that the commanding officers live in.
Just apologize for not inviting you to join the party downstairs tonight, but I'm afraid that it's a dress affair.
Thank you, sir, but I must confess that this is not entirely a social visit.
Oh, come, Dax, let's not go over all that ground again.
It's brilliantly contrasted with the harsh brutality of the war and of the folks, fighting on the front in World War I.
Yeah, the sets were awesome, and yeah, it's crazy to think this movie was made in the 1950s. Did you think? I thought it's aged really well. Did you think that those sets were they just good looking for how old they were, or do you think they stood the test of time?
No, I think they looked great. I think that they could be in a modern film today. Obviously wouldn't be in black and white, but even in black and white, they were gorgeous. Overall, lots to like. What I didn't like, so I get that Kubrick and the screenwriters were trying to contrast like the evil generals with the honorable enlisted men on the front, but sometimes that point was a bit on the nose. General Maru at times can come off as a mustache twirling villain with no real motivation other than his own ambition.
The men died wonderfully. There's always that chance that one of them will do something that will leave everyone with a bad taste. This time you couldn't ask for better. Oh, Colonel Dax, your men died very well.
He's occasionally like overly cruel to make that point. And I just think the film would have been better served to give him a more relatable motivation and maybe even some like internal conflict. Once he accepts the promotion, he's just gung-ho bad guy. And I think that would have shifted the villain of the story from a few people, the evil generals, to the overall horrors of war. I think maybe should have been the bad guy. Also, I think Kubrick should have maybe told General Maru to dial back his performance just a tad and use some subtlety to make it a little more believable. The film also suffers from too much awkward exposition at the beginning that's really unnecessary. So at one point, Maru says about Colonel Dax, but we mustn't forget that the colonel was perhaps the foremost criminal lawyer in all France, sort of out of nowhere. Like they weren't talking about that. He just mentions it so that the audience knows. And this is setting the stage for him to defend his men later in the movie in that like trial sequence, but it just wasn't necessary and it ended up feeling awkward. And there were a few of those moments. But like I said, overall, I really liked it. I would give it an 8 out of 10. Fantastic recommendation.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. I really liked just seeing the French military and the hierarchy and how the guys on the ground in the trenches are having to do the most gritty, like dangerous stuff, and then seeing the generals talk in their ivory towers. Yeah, I really like seeing that contrast. I didn't really think this felt like a typical Stanley Kubrick movie. I felt like the pace was really fast. The dialogue was a big carrier of the story. Did you notice that? Did you think it was kind of a different Kubrick movie? I mean, they're all weird and different, but this one was a super approachable, I thought.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree, like there was a lot more dialogue than his normal films. A lot of times he'll rely heavily on some of the visuals, of course 2001 being the best example. And there are some spectacular visuals in this movie, as I mentioned. But yeah, it seems like it definitely feels like one of his early movies where he's finding his style.
And let's get into what I watched. I watched the movie 45 Years that you recommended. Can you tell us a little bit about what this 45 Years movie is?
45 Years is a drama about an old married couple, and they're preparing for their 45th wedding anniversary. They've been together forever. But days before this big party, the husband, Jeff, who's played by Tom Courtenay, he receives news that his first love, who was frozen in ice in a hiking accident, has been found. And she was somehow perfectly preserved in ice all these years.
She's been there over 50 years. Like something in the freezer. Now they've found her.
And Jeff starts to become obsessed with these memories of her, much to the dismay of Kate, who is played by Charlotte Rampling very well, who is losing her husband and the man who she's loved for 45 years to his old memories and nostalgia for his long-lost love. So, Zach, what did you think of 45 Years?
All right, let's start with what I liked about this movie. I really liked the font that they used for the credits. And that's it for what I liked. Just kidding. But for real, let's get what I liked out of the way because there's not much. I feel like the production's there. Acting, there was never a point when I'm like, this is cheesy or anything like that. It's a very serious film, and I feel like the production is very serious and professional. There's British fields, and that automatically makes the cinematography good. I went back and watched the beginning part again, and I noticed that there's some like clues that's giving away the end of the movie. In this case, The opening credits, it's just a black scene where it's showing, the actors' names and stuff. You hear somebody switching through an old 1960s projection photo thing, and then later you go in the story, somebody's doing that. They're going through photos, and it's a really big moment in the story. So I thought that was cool. They were kind of giving clues about that. There was a conversation that I really liked between Kate, the main character, and her friend about the importance of events like anniversaries, like the 45th anniversary that they're having, and family reunions and stuff like that. They talk about how nobody ever wants to go and everybody's dreading it. But once the event actually happens, everybody's crying. Everybody's always glad they went to the reunion. And so I thought that was kind of a relatable conversation. And then I also enjoyed how sometimes a scene starts right in the middle of a conversation. And even though you missed a key point that was said in that conversation, you can figure out what it was in the dialogue you see. An example is there's a car scene where there's a lot of tension, and eventually one of the characters says something like, "Are you going to tell me?" And then the other character responds, "All he said was George was in a strange mood." And then so they're obviously gossiping about, previous conversations. And I thought that was kind of fun to try to figure out what's going on. But unfortunately, George was in a strange mood. I'd say that sentence encapsulates not only the first 45 minutes of the movie, it's just the theme of this movie. There's this guy, George, and he's in a strange mood. So that kind of begins the things I do not like about 45 years. I've been thinking about this a lot because this is one of those movies that the critics love it. It's got an Oscar nomination. It stars Charlotte Rampling, who is a well-established English actor. I think I'm partly to blame. 45 Years is a super narrow real-life drama. It reminded me of those absolutely bleak British drama shows like Broadchurch and Happy Valley, but without any of the exciting events. I'm just not into the subject matter of this movie, which is Kate's husband is acting very off, and Kate wonders why for about 75 minutes. And during these times, we just get these dull moments. Like Kate is looking at a venue for their anniversary reception, and all we see is a conversation about the seating arrangements. I thought there were way too many conversations and dialogue about the past, Oh, did I really do that? It's been over 30 years. How could I remember that? It was a long time ago. I would have remembered that if I did that.
I feel sure I've told you before, but it was a long time ago. So I remember telling you clear as day.
Of course I remember. It was a long time ago.
Yeah. It got old. And I think flashbacks would have added a lot to this movie. Show me what happened. That's the whole point of a movie. Don't just depressingly talk about it and then sit there from an interesting camera angle. The story is more so told through the facial expressions and the body language of the characters. I'm already bored with this subject, and you're going to make me work. So overall, yeah, I just was not into the subject matter of this movie. It wasn't cheesy. It wasn't amateur in any way, but I just couldn't care less about what was going on. So I would have to go with a score of 3 out of 10. And Cody, I promise that this isn't just because you didn't like Hot Fuzz as much as I wanted you to.
Well, the fact that you mention it makes me think that is the reason. But so the only real criticism I heard was that just all of it got old and I didn't care. And,
yeah.
I get that. It's maybe hardly enough to justify a 3 out of 10. Last episode, you suggested that I need to appreciate British culture more. So your reaction is surprising. Now, it may not be the caliber of something like a Hot Fuzz, but a 3 out of 10 says to me that you almost hate it so much that you love it. So I would encourage you to sit with it for a while, let it sink in, and maybe think about it in a few weeks. It might come back to you, and you might like it. Also, I would dispute some of what you said. For example, Kate's husband is acting very off, and Kate wonders why for 75 minutes.
Yep.
So Kate knows why her husband is acting off. He's falling back in love with his memory of another woman. She knows that from the very first time they have that conversation. He's consumed by this long lost love from his past, and he starts to completely ignore Kate. And then he starts being shady about it, like breaking the trust of this partnership that has lasted for 45 years. And like over the course of the movie, she realizes she never really knew this man who she's known and loved for all that time.
Yeah, and that's great. It's super realistic. Like it might be something people go through, like past relationships, totally real, and it's just not relatable to me.
That's fair. Yeah, you also said there are too many conversations about the past, and that's the entire movie, like the past coming back to haunt them. So, question for you. I told you to watch out for the blue light. Several key moments throughout the story when Kate is first kind of going to bed after the first time she hears about the ex-girlfriend in the ice, there's this faint blue light that shines on them as she's awake and her husband is sleeping. And then it happens several times. They get in an argument in the kitchen, and we see the blue light come back, and it's pretty prominent. And then also towards the end, when they're during like the dance scene. And I think that this is meant to be a ghost story. They are haunted by, or Kate really is haunted by the memory of this woman who is competing for her husband's affection even 45 years into their marriage. So, Zach, was this a ghost story?
Yeah, when you said that, I was like looking for like a blue light bulb the whole movie. So I didn't. Okay, so maybe that went over my head, and that's interesting, and that's fine. Like I said, like I think this is everything about it is professional and well thought out. I just wish this production team, these actors, I wish they were given a different script. That's all. I just was not interested in this lady's jealousy. I think it could almost be a small piece of a bigger story going on, but it just wasn't enough. It would be like my nephew watching Pulp Fiction. If my nephew would rather watch Pikachu than Pulp Fiction, does that make Pulp Fiction bad in any way? No. I'm not saying this is a perfect comparison, but I feel like this movie was definitely not made for me at all, and that's fine, but after watching it, that's how I felt about it.
Yeah, he's not going to be into Pulp Fiction because his brain is not, fully developed.
Now, not a perfect analogy.
My perception of what you didn't like is the stakes were too low. Like, who cares if some random old people's marriage is in trouble right before their anniversary party? And I get it. Like, we so rarely see these small character-driven, dialogue-heavy movies that aren't about, people dying or showing off some epic imagery. And I think, Zach, your reaction to this movie is why. Most people want escapism when they sit down to watch a movie.
Yeah.
And this film does not offer any escapism. It's a beautifully dry depiction of the end of two lives and the end of a relationship, and how we kind of carry some things from our past into the end of life. So I get that. My recommendation for next episode may need to be tweaked. I considered 45 years as a gateway drug to something really artsy and abstract, but apparently in an attempt to inoculate you to good cinema, I may have given you more than you can handle. So let's see. Have you seen any of the Transformers movies? You might like those ones. No. I think we've established some guidelines, about what we like, what we don't like. I don't like, juvenile, campy movies with obvious humor, and you don't like these kind of boring, dialogue-heavy movies about old people, and that's totally fine. So, however, I figure, why stop with a 3 out of 10? Let's go for broke, right? I think I can get a 1 out of 10 by ratcheting up the level of cinema even more. Right? I've been in a phase, and I want someone else to go through the same pain and frustration of watching super pretentious movies. So let's go for broke. I'm going to recommend the most pretentious movie on my list of favorite movies, and that's Ingmar Bergman's 1966 masterpiece, Persona. It's all surrealism and abstract. If you watch this one day before that we do a podcast and you don't really pay attention to it and let it marinate, you're going to hate it like 45 years. I'm looking forward to more specific criticism next time, though, hopefully. I hated Persona the first time I watched it. It just seemed like an ambiguous, imagery meant to be artsy. But the more I thought about it, the more I loved it. I would suggest to get the full experience, watch it through. Don't try to analyze it while you're watching it. Just kind of absorb it. And then if you're really going to appreciate it, like read about it, some analysis, think about it, maybe rewatch it after doing all of that. I'm recommending this one because it's one of the few movies where I've done a complete 180. It started out as something I hated and ended up as something that I absolutely love.
All right, Persona sounds good. I'm looking forward to it. I am open to watching anything. Next episode, you will be reviewing Life is Beautiful. And the reason I haven't recommended this movie before is I just assume you'd seen it. It's kind of like that much of a staple in the film library that a lot of people should watch. I feel like it's a classic movie. Probably a lot of listeners have already seen it. And all I'll say is it takes place, during the Holocaust. It's a Holocaust movie. You cry, but you also laugh a lot. So yeah, I'm really surprised you haven't seen this yet, and looking forward to what you think about it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's another one of those kind of like passive glory that I've had my eye on, and I'm semi-familiar with the story, but I'm definitely looking forward to having an excuse to watch it. To the folks at home, thanks a lot for sticking with us as we watch these movies. We did recommend 2 foreign films for next week, so hopefully you don't mind watching movies that are not in English if you decide to follow along. But if you do, please check out the movies we talked about this episode or the movies we'll talk about next episode.
Yeah, thanks everybody for listening. One question that we're getting is, when are you going to make another podcast? If you want to get a notification wherever you're listening to this, just find the subscribe button and then subscribe, and then you'll get a notification to your phone as soon as we release another episode. Besides that, thank you so much for listening. And if you have any ideas of what we should watch for recommendations in the future, drop those in the comments. And we will see you next episode. So have a good one, everybody. Keep watching movies and keep talking about movies.